The cold that morning had a weight to it, not just the kind that stings your face or stiffens your fingers, the kind that presses down on everything, on the branches, on the snow, on the air itself, the kind of cold that makes a forest feel like it's holding its breath. Nikolai had walked this trail for over 40 years. He knew every bend, every hollow, every tree that leaned a little too far east. His boots found the path without him thinking about it, muscle memory built from decades of early mornings, quiet skies, and the slow rhythm of a life lived close to the land. He was 63 years old, retired from a job he rarely spoke about, living alone in a small cabin at the edge of a Siberian forest that most people never visited, and fewer still understood. He didn't mind the solitude. Some men were built for crowds. Nikolai was built for this. He moved slowly between the trees, checking the line of small traps he kept for rabbits and fox. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But then, he noticed something. The forest was silent. Not the comfortable silence of early morning, when birds haven't yet started and the world is simply still. This was different. This was the silence of every living thing choosing not to move, the kind of silence that happens when something has already gone wrong. Nikolai stopped walking. He stood for a moment, just listening. His breath came out in slow white clouds. The bare branches above him were completely still. No wind, no birdsong, not even the soft creak of settling wood. And then he heard it, a sound, low, strained. Not loud enough to be alarming, but wrong in a way that moved through him before he could explain why. He looked down. There, half hidden beneath the snow and a tangle of dead brush, was an animal caught in one of his older traps. A rusted steel jaw trap he thought he'd cleared from this section weeks ago. He took one step closer and stopped. It was a Pallas's cat, a manual, one of the oldest wildcat species on Earth, compact and heavily built, with thick winter fur that had turned a pale silver gray at the tips. Its face was round and flat, almost owlish, with eyes that were pale gold and wide, and completely still. Its front paw was clamped in the trap. The metal had bitten down just above the joint. There was no blood visible. The cold had likely numbed everything, but the paw was swollen, and the fur around the trap was matted with ice crystals, where the moisture from its skin had frozen overnight. Nikolai had seen animals caught in traps before. He'd seen rabbits tear themselves half apart trying to escape. He'd seen foxes that had been fighting the metal all night, panting and wild-eyed and dangerous even in exhaustion. He knew what a frightened, trapped wild animal looked like. This was not that. The metal was not fighting. It was not thrashing or screaming or trying to drag itself away. It lay in the snow with a stillness that was almost unnatural, and when Nikolai crouched down slowly, moving the way you move when you're trying not to be a threat, the cat turned its head and looked at him, not with panic, not with the flat aggressive warning you'd expect from a wild animal cornered and in pain. It looked at him with something harder to name, steady, watchful, as if it was waiting to see what kind of man he was. Nikolai felt the weight of that look in a way he couldn't explain. He should have gone back to the cabin for proper equipment, thick gloves, a catch pole, something to protect himself if the animal turned. That would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing. Instead, he stayed where he was. He pulled off his outer gloves, thick wool lined with sheepskin, and set them on the snow beside him. Underneath, he had a thinner pair, not much protection but enough to work with. He reached slowly toward the trap with both hands, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried, speaking quietly as he did, not words exactly, just sound, low and even, the kind of tone that says I'm not here to hurt you without needing language to carry it. The manual watched him. Its ears, normally upright and alert, lay slightly flattened, a warning, but it didn't move. Nikolai got his fingers around both sides of the trap's spring mechanism. The metal was old, corroded from seasons of moisture and frost. It resisted him. He pressed harder, and the edge of the trap bit into his gloves, cutting through to the thinner layer beneath. He felt the cold metal against his fingers. He pressed again. A long moment. Then, with a sound like a breath finally released, the trap opened. The manual's paw came free. The cat pulled back immediately, scrambling upright in the snow, and Nikolai sat back on his heels and stayed still, giving it room, giving it space, not reaching, not moving. His heart was going faster than he expected. The manual stood a few feet away. It put weight on the injured paw, tested it, then shifted its weight off again. It shook its head once, slowly, the way cats do when something isn't right. Then it paused, and it looked back at him, not the quick, survival-driven glance of an animal checking whether the threat had moved. Something slower than that, something that lasted longer than it needed to. Nikolai didn't move. The manual held his gaze for what felt like a full minute, though he couldn't have said exactly. Long enough that he noticed the color of its eyes in the flat winter light. Long enough that the cold settled back into his fingers and he still didn't move. And something passed between them in that silence. He couldn't name it, he wouldn't have tried, but he felt it. Then the cat turned, and without any hurry it walked into the tree line, and disappeared. Nikolai stayed crouched in the snow for a long moment after it was gone. He looked at the open trap in front of him, the matted fur and ice crystals left behind in the snow, the small set of prints leading away into the dark between the trees. He thought it was over. He had no way of knowing, it was only just beginning. Nikolai didn't tell anyone about the manual. There was no one to tell, really. His nearest neighbor lived 11 kilometers down the road, and their conversations rarely went beyond weather and firewood. He had a daughter in the city who called on Sundays, but their talks were short and careful in the way that talks become when too many years have passed without enough said. So he kept it to himself. He went back the next morning and removed every remaining trap from that section of the forest. All of them, even the ones that were still functional. He carried them back to the cabin and stacked them in the corner of the shed and didn't touch them again. He told himself it was just good practice, overdue maintenance, nothing more. But he found himself thinking about the cat. Not obsessively, not in a way he could even fully explain, just the image of it, standing in the snow after the trap released, that pause, that look. It stayed with him the way certain moments do, the ones that feel like they mean something even before you understand what. A week passed. He went about his usual routines, chopped wood, cleared the path to the well, made his slow morning walks through the forest, checking nothing now, just walking, which was its own kind of purpose. On the 8th day, he saw movement at the edge of the tree line. He was coming back from the well, carrying 2 full buckets, and he almost missed it. A shape, low to the ground, half hidden in the shadow between 2 spruce trees. He stopped. The manual sat at the border of the clearing, not close, 30 meters at least. Far enough that a different man might have convinced himself it was just a trick of the light, a stump, a shadow with the right kind of shape. But Nikolai had spent 40 years reading this forest. He knew what he was looking at. He stood still. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward it. The cat sat watching him for perhaps 2 minutes. Then it turned and walked back into the trees without urgency, without alarm, the way you leave a place when you're ready to leave, not when you're forced to. Nikolai carried his water inside and set the buckets by the stove. He stood at the window for a long time after. It came back 3 days later, same position, same edge of the clearing, same stillness that was somehow different from the stillness of the surrounding forest, more deliberate, more directed. This time Nikolai tried something. He walked slowly toward it. The manual watched him come. When he'd closed perhaps half the distance between them, it stood, not tense, not aggressive, simply upright, and retreated into the tree line, not running, walking, as if it had set a boundary and was simply enforcing it, calmly, without drama. He stopped where he was. He stood there in the clearing for a few minutes, feeling slightly foolish, then went back inside. But the next morning, he left something on the flat stone near the woodpile. A piece of dried meat, small enough that it might have been accidental. He told himself he wasn't sure why he did it. By evening it was gone. The pattern that developed over the following weeks was unlike anything Nikolai had experienced with a wild animal. It didn't approach him. It didn't allow itself to be fed by hand, or touched, or called. It didn't behave like a rescued animal warming to a caretaker. There was none of the gradual domestication he might have expected, the slow erosion of distance that happens when a wild creature begins to associate a human with safety and food. This was something different. The manual appeared at the edge of the clearing most evenings around dusk. Sometimes in the mornings, it would sit for a while, watching the cabin, watching him when he was visible, and then it would leave. If he moved toward it, it retreated. If he stayed still, it stayed too. It kept exactly the distance it wanted to keep, no more, no less. What struck him most was the quality of its attention. Most animals, when they watch a human, are assessing threat. Their eyes move, their ears rotate, they track your hands, your feet, your direction of movement. Every part of them is running a calculation, danger or no danger, stay or go. The manual didn't watch him like that. It watched him the way you watch something you're simply curious about, patient and unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. And this watching was enough. He began to wonder, on the long quiet evenings, whether the animal was lonely. Then he caught himself and felt the strangeness of the thought. Wild mammals were solitary by nature. They didn't seek company. They didn't get lonely in any way that resembled what humans meant by the word. And yet, spring arrived slowly that year. The snow retreated from the clearing first, then from the south-facing slopes, then gradually from the deep shadows under the older trees. The light changed. The mornings came earlier and lasted longer. The manual's winter coat began to shed, revealing the darker summer markings beneath, gray-brown streaks along the flanks, a paler chest. It looked slightly different in the warmer months, leaner, more angular, still unmistakable. Summer came. The visits continued, though less frequent now. Every few days instead of every evening. Nikolai noticed the cat sometimes arrived with the faint smell of something he couldn't identify, a wildness that was more present in warm weather, carried on air that moved instead of stood still. He stopped leaving food on the stone, not because he wanted the cat to leave, but because it felt wrong somehow, like he was trying to close a distance the animal had chosen to keep, and that choice deserved to be respected. Autumn came. The leaves turned and fell, and the cold moved back in from the north. The visits became more sporadic. One week he didn't see the manana at all. Then it was there again on a Tuesday evening, sitting at its usual spot, watching the cabin windows glow orange in the early dark. Then winter returned. And with the first heavy snowfall of the season, the manual stopped appearing. Nikolai waited. He didn't say this to himself, "I'm waiting," but he found himself checking the tree line more than usual, glancing up from his morning coffee, pausing on the path back from the well. A week passed. Then two. He told himself the cat had simply moved its range. That was normal. Manuals covered large territories, especially in winter when prey was harder to find. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't unexpected. He believed this, mostly. Spring came again, then summer, then another autumn, then a second winter settled over the forest, and the snow came back, and the mornings grew dark and cold in the way he knew so well. 2 full years passed. The forest was the same. His routines were the same. The cabin, the well, the woodpile, the slow morning walks, all of it continued as it always had. The life of a man who had made peace, mostly, with the particular shape of his solitude. He had stopped checking the tree line. And then, late on a Tuesday evening in the deep of that second winter, he was sitting near the stove with a cup of tea going cold in his hand, reading a book he'd already read twice before. And he heard a sound outside the cabin door. He looked up. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't the random creak and settle of a wooden structure in the cold. It was deliberate, a sound at the door, low, measured, repeated, patient in a way that wind and branches never are. Nikolai set down his cup. He sat very still for a moment, listening. Then he stood up, crossed the room and put his hand on the door, and something in the quality of the silence outside made him pause before he opened it. Because whatever was on the other side of that door, he already knew, somehow, it wasn't going to be nothing. He opened the door. The cold came in first, sharp and immediate, the way Siberian winter cold always arrives, like it's been waiting just outside for exactly this moment. The lantern on the wall threw a pale yellow circle across the snow of the porch, and beyond that, darkness. Nikolai stood in the doorway and looked down, and there it was, the manual, standing on the bottom step of the porch, not 2 meters from his feet, close, closer than it had ever allowed itself to be in all those months of careful, measured distance. Close enough that he could see the individual guard hairs of its thick winter coat catching the lantern light. Close enough to see its breath. He didn't move. The cat looked different. Older. There was something in the face that hadn't been there before, a slight heaviness around the jaw, a few pale patches near the ears where the fur had grown back differently after some old injury he'd never known about, but it was stronger too. The body beneath that coat was solid and dense, built by 2 winters of surviving on its own terms in a forest that asked no favors of anything. It was the same animal. He was certain of that in a way that needed no proof. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Nikolai noticed something else. The manual was not alone. He couldn't see clearly at first. The darkness past the porch light was thick and absolute, but there was movement in it, small movements, low to the ground, shifting and then stilling again in the way young animals do when they're uncertain. He counted 3, maybe 4 shapes in the darkness just beyond the reach of the light, sitting close together in the snow, watching him with small pale eyes that caught the lantern glow and held it. Kittens. nearly grown but still carrying the slightly oversized look of animals that hadn't quite settled into their own proportions yet. Pallas's cat young, born in spring he guessed, which would make them perhaps 7 or 8 months old now, old enough to travel, old enough to learn. He understood then, with a slowness that felt appropriate to the moment, what he was looking at. She had come back, and she had brought them with her. He stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking, without moving. The cold worked its way through his wool socks and up through the floorboards, but he barely registered it. The mother, he thought of her that way now, though he'd never assigned her a gender before, stood on the bottom step and watched him with that familiar steadiness. That quality of attention that was not assessment and not fear, and not anything he had a clean word for. Then she did something unexpected. She turned, not away from him, not the retreat he'd learned to expect whenever he'd tried to close the distance between them. She turned sideways, took 3 deliberate steps toward the tree line, and stopped, looked back at him. Nikolai felt something move through his chest. He knew that pattern. He had seen it once before, years ago, in a different season, in a version of himself that was standing in the snow staring at an open trap and not yet understanding what was beginning. The same turn, the same pause, the same look that said, with absolute clarity, "Follow." He reached back inside the cabin and took the lantern from its hook on the wall. He pulled on his boots, his coat, his gloves, moving quickly but carefully, the way you move when something feels important and you don't want to break whatever fragile thread is holding the moment together. When he stepped off the porch, the kittens scattered backward into the darkness, but the mother stayed where she was, watching him come down the steps. When he reached the bottom, she turned again and began to walk. He followed her into the forest. The lantern threw moving shadows across the snow. The trees closed in around him, the familiar shapes of spruce and larch that he knew in daylight, but that took on different proportions at night, taller and more anonymous, the spaces between them deeper than they appeared. The manual moved ahead of him at a pace that was not hurried but was purposeful in a way that made hurry unnecessary. She stayed at the edge of his lantern light, close enough to follow, far enough that he couldn't have reached her if he'd tried, pausing occasionally to look back, making sure he was still there. Behind him, at some distance he couldn't gauge, he could sense the kittens following. He didn't look back, he kept his eyes on her. The snow was deep here, away from any trail, and it pulled at his boots with every step. His breath came harder. The cold was more intense away from the cabin, the kind of deep forest cold that has no wind in it, just temperature, clean and absolute. They walked for perhaps 8 or 9 minutes, long enough that the cabin lights disappeared entirely behind him. Nikolai didn't feel afraid. He registered, somewhere in the practical part of his mind, that this was unusual, that most men of 63, alone in a Siberian forest at night following a wild cat by lantern light, would feel at least a trace of unease. He felt none. He felt, if he was honest, something closer to certainty, a sense that the direction of this moment had been set long before tonight, and that his only task was to keep walking. Then the manual stopped. She stopped so suddenly that Nikolai took 2 more steps before he registered it. He raised the lantern. They were in a small depression between 2 fallen larches, old trees, dead for years, their trunks half sunk into the snow and frosted over with a thick white crust. The kind of sheltered hollow that collects wind-blown debris and holds heat slightly better than open ground, a place an animal might choose for exactly those reasons. The manual stood at the edge of this hollow and looked at him. Then she looked down. Nikolai followed her gaze. And his heart stopped. There, curled against the base of the nearer fallen tree, almost entirely buried under a drift of wind-blown snow, was a child, a boy, small, 8 years old perhaps, or 9, dressed in a heavy winter coat that had done its job up to a point but was now dark with moisture and packed with snow at every seam. His face was turned slightly to one side, pressed against his folded arm. His lips had a bluish cast in the lantern light. He was not moving. But his breath, Nikolai dropped to his knees immediately and brought the lantern close. His breath was there, faint, shallow, a small cloud of vapor appearing and disappearing above his slightly parted lips in a rhythm that was too slow, too quiet, but present. He was alive. Nikolai pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck. The pulse was there, weak and irregular, the heartbeat of a body that had been spending its reserves for hours and was running low. Hypothermia, advanced. The boy needed warmth, and he needed it now, and the cabin was 8 or 9 minutes away, through deep snow in the dark, and Nikolai was 63 years old, with a left knee that had been unreliable for a decade, and 2 arms that were strong enough for wood chopping, but had not carried anything heavier than firewood in years. He didn't hesitate. He worked his arms under the boy, under the knees, under the shoulders, and lifted. The child was heavier than he looked, damp clothing and dead weight, and the awkward geometry of carrying a limp body through uneven terrain. Nikolai felt his knee protest immediately. He ignored it. He turned back the way he'd come, the lantern now hanging from 2 fingers of the hand supporting the boy's legs, throwing a swinging uneven light across the snow. He couldn't move quickly. He moved steadily, which was the next best thing. The manual stayed with him. Not close. She kept her distance, weaving between the trees alongside him rather than leading now. The kittens had melted back into the darkness entirely. But she was there, a shape at the edge of the lantern's reach, moving when he moved, pausing when he paused to adjust his grip or catch his breath. She stayed with him all the way back to the tree line. At the edge of the clearing, where the cabin lights came back into view, Nikolai stopped for a moment. Not from exhaustion, though he was exhausted, but from something that rose in him suddenly and needed a moment to be acknowledged. He turned his head toward where the manual stood in the shadow of the last trees. She looked back at him. In the darkness between them, he understood something he couldn't have articulated to anyone, in any language, in any words that would have made sense outside of that particular moment, in that particular forest, on that particular night. She had remembered. 2 years and a season between them, and she had remembered, and when she found someone in the cold who needed what she couldn't give, she had known exactly where to go. Nikolai turned back to the cabin. He crossed the clearing with the boy in his arms, pushed open the door with his shoulder, and moved toward the warmth of the stove. Behind him he heard nothing, only the snow, only the dark, only the silence of a forest that for the first time in a long time felt less empty than before. The cabin filled with warmth the way it always did, slowly, from the center outward, the stove working against the cold that had followed Nikolai in through the door, and now retreated reluctantly toward the corners of the room. He laid the boy on the cot near the stove, gently. The way you set down something fragile, something borrowed, something that doesn't belong to you but has been placed in your care for reasons you don't yet fully understand. The child didn't stir. Nikolai worked quickly and quietly. He'd had basic wilderness first aid training decades ago, the kind they gave to men who worked in remote places where help was always far away. Most of it had stayed with him the way practical knowledge does, stored not in memory exactly but in the hands, in the instincts. He removed the boy's outer coat. The inner layers were damp but not soaked through. The heavy wool had done some work after all. He wrapped the child in the 2 blankets from his own bed, then heated water on the stove and filled the old rubber bottle he kept for cold nights and tucked it at the boy's feet. He pulled his chair close and sat and watched the boy breathe. The color came back slowly, first to the cheeks, a faint flush replacing the waxy pallor that had frightened him in the forest. Then the lips lost their bluish cast and returned to something closer to normal. The breathing deepened, the rhythm steadied, the intervals between breaths became more regular. At some point past midnight, the boy's eyelids moved, then opened. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment with the unfocused look of someone returning from a very long distance. Then his eyes found Nikolai sitting beside him, and he went rigid, the sudden animal fear of waking somewhere unfamiliar with a stranger watching you. Nikolai raised one hand slowly. Steady, easy. You're safe, he said. You're warm, you're inside. Simple words, said quietly. The same tone he'd used in the forest years ago, crouched in the snow in front of a trapped animal, trying to communicate something that language was almost too large and clumsy a tool to carry. The boy stared at him. Then, by degrees, the rigidity left his small body and he sank back into the blankets. Where am I? His voice was rough and thin. My cabin, about 4 kilometers northeast of the Version Inn Road, if that means anything to you. The boy blinked slowly. I was looking for the road. I know. Nikolai stood. I'm going to call for help now. Your family will be looking for you. They came within the hour. A search party had been out since before dark. The boy's father, 2 neighbors and a forestry officer with a radio and a truck. They'd been working a grid search from the last confirmed sighting, which had been nearly 6 hours before Nikolai found the child. 6 hours in those temperatures. The forestry officer, a practical man not given to unnecessary statements, told Nikolai quietly, while the boy's father held his son in the doorway of the cabin, that another hour, maybe less, and the outcome would have been different. The father's name was Dmitri. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, with hands that shook when he held his boy, and eyes that couldn't settle on anything for more than a moment. He kept looking at Nikolai, and then looking away, as if direct gratitude was more than he currently had the capacity to manage. "How did you find him?" he asked finally. "In the dark, that far from the trail." Nikolai was quiet for a moment. "I had help," he said. Dmitri waited for more. Nikolai didn't offer it. Some things, he had learned over 63 years, are better held quietly. Not because they're secret exactly, but because there are no words for them that don't make them smaller than they actually are. The boy's name was Alyosha. He came back to visit 3 weeks later, when the cold had eased slightly and his mother felt comfortable letting him make the trip. He came with his father and a jar of his grandmother's preserves, and a slightly formal handshake that made Nikolai want to smile. They sat at the kitchen table and drank tea, and the boy asked careful, serious questions about the forest. The kind of questions children ask when they're still carrying the weight of a recent fear and trying to understand the world that contained it. Nikolai answered each one honestly. At one point, Alyosha looked out the window toward the tree line and asked, with the directness that children sometimes use when they sense there's a real answer to be had, "Was it an animal that helped you find me?" Nikolai looked at the boy for a moment. "Yes," he said. "What kind?" "A Pallas's cat, a manual." He paused. "Wild, lives in the forest." Alyosha considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Why did it help?" Nikolai wrapped both hands around his teacup. The stove ticked quietly beside them. Outside, the snow was beginning again, soft and unhurried, the kind that falls when there's no wind, straight down, covering everything evenly. "I'm not sure," he said. "I think maybe," he stopped, started again. "A few years ago I helped it, when it needed help." The boy looked at him. "And it remembered?" "It remembered." Alyosha turned this over in his mind with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands, instinctively, that some ideas need time before they'll lie flat. Then he nodded, once, slowly, as if the world had just revealed something to him that he intended to keep. In the days that followed, Nikolai returned to his routines, chopped wood, cleared the path to the well, made his slow morning walks through the forest that he had walked for 40 years and that still, after all of it, had things left to show him. He didn't expect to see the Manul again. He didn't say this to himself as a loss, exactly, more as an acknowledgement. Some things arrive in your life, do what they came to do, and then return to wherever they came from. You don't hold on to them. You don't try to make them stay. You carry what they left behind, and that's enough. That has to be enough. He had made peace with a great many things over 63 years. He was reasonably good at it by now. And then, 4 days after Alyosha's visit, on a gray Tuesday morning with fresh snow on the ground and ice on the well handle and a sky the color of old pewter, he saw movement at the tree line. He was standing on the porch with his morning coffee, not looking for anything in particular, just standing the way he did most mornings, present and unhurried, belonging to the moment without needing it to be more than it was. The shape emerged from the tree line slowly, the manual, alone this time, without the kittens, without the urgency of that night, moving across the open snow of the clearing with the deliberate, grounded pace of an animal that has nowhere to be except exactly where it is. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. The distance between them was perhaps 25 meters, the same distance, more or less, as always. Nikolai held his coffee cup and didn't move. The manual sat down in the snow. It looked at him, that familiar, unhurried attention, the kind that had no calculation in it, and no fear, only a quality of presence that Nikolai had never found a name for and had stopped trying to name. The snow fell softly between them. Small flakes, slow-moving, disappearing into the pale fur of the cat's coat and into the shoulders of Nikolai's jacket with equal indifference. The forest behind the animal was dark and still and vast in the way that only winter forests are. That particular depth that makes you aware of your own smallness without making you feel diminished by it. They stayed like that for a long time. Two living things, on either side of a distance that had always been there and had never, not once, felt like separation. Then the manual stood. It turned, unhurried, complete, and walked back toward the tree line. No pause this time, no backward glance. The steady, self-possessed exit of an animal returning to a life that was whole and sufficient and entirely its own. Nikolai watched until the gray shape dissolved into the gray shadows of the trees and was gone. He stood on the porch for a while longer. The coffee had gone cold in his hand. The snow continued to fall. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch shifted under its accumulated weight and released, a soft, clean sound that carried a long way in the still air. He thought about the boy, asleep on his cot in the lamplight. He thought about the rusted trap in the snow, and a cold morning, and a decision made without thinking too hard about the reasons. He thought about how certain moments, small moments, quiet moments, the kind that happen without witnesses and without ceremony, turn out to be the ones that matter most. And he thought, as he finally turned and went back inside, about what it means to give something freely to the world. Not expecting return, not keeping count, just giving it, and then letting it go. Because sometimes, not always, not as a rule, not as a promise the world makes and keeps, but sometimes, what you release into the wild finds its way back to you, in the form you least expected, at the moment you needed it most.